There is something almost painfully quiet about the way a rock star's final chapter can arrive. For more than 5 decades, Frank Beard's name was connected to a sound that could fill an arena before anyone even saw the musicians on stage. But when the lights went out and the crowds disappeared, there was another life waiting for him. A quieter life. A Texas life. A life built around family, friendships, interests, memories, and the simple things that never appeared on an album cover. But when his final days came, there were no stadium lights around him. There was his Texas home. There was his family. And there was the private life he had spent years building far away from the noise of celebrity. Frank Beard, the longtime drummer of ZZ Top, died on August 17, 2026, at the age of 77. He was receiving hospice care at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, with family members beside him. And after his death, those things suddenly meant something different. A house is no longer just a house when the person who filled it with memories is gone. A photograph is no longer just a photograph. A car, a piece of memorabilia, a familiar room, an old recording, even a song that once sounded like pure entertainment can become something much heavier. Because behind the fortune associated with Frank Beard was something no bank account could measure. There was a lifetime. There was the man who had spent more than 50 years helping create one of America's most recognizable rock bands. There were the people who knew him before the applause. And there were all the pieces of a life that remained when the person himself could no longer walk back through the door. So what did Frank Beard actually leave behind? What was waiting inside the private world he had built after more than 5 decades of fame? And why could the things left behind become more emotional to the people closest to him than the fortune itself? To understand that, you have to go back to a time before the beards, the sunglasses, the enormous stages, and the unmistakable image of ZZ Top. Frank Lee Beard was born in Frankston, Texas, and grew up in Irving. As a teenager, he became drawn to the drums, developing an interest in the rhythm and energy of rock and blues. His musical path eventually brought him together with another young Texas musician, Dusty Hill. That friendship would become one of the most important musical partnerships of his life. Before ZZ Top became a worldwide name, Beard and Hill were young musicians trying to find their place. They performed together and crossed paths with the Texas blues scene, including performances connected to Lightnin' Hopkins. Those early experiences placed Beard inside a musical tradition that valued rhythm, groove, and feel as much as technical showmanship. Then came 1969. Billy Gibbons was building a new band in Houston. Dusty Hill became the bassist. Frank Beard became the drummer. And the 3 musicians created something that would last far longer than anyone could have predicted. ZZ Top was never built around a complicated lineup. There was Billy Gibbons on guitar and vocals, Dusty Hill on bass and vocals, and Frank Beard behind the drums. 3 men, 1 sound. Beard was not the member standing at the microphone. He was not the guitarist whose solos became instantly recognizable. And unlike Gibbons and Hill, he did not become famous for a huge beard. In fact, the joke was almost too perfect. The man named Beard was the only member without the famous beard. But behind the kit, his role was anything but a joke. His drumming became one of the foundations of ZZ Top's identity. The band's sound was rooted in Texas blues, boogie and rock, and Beard's precise, forceful playing gave those songs their movement. His backbeat sat underneath Gibbons' guitar and Hill's bass, creating the rhythmic engine that allowed ZZ Top to sound loose without ever losing control. By the early 1970s, the band was beginning to establish itself. Then came Tres Hombres in 1973. The album helped move ZZ Top from a respected Texas act into a major rock band. It contained La Grange, a song that became one of the group's defining recordings, driven by a groove that seemed simple until you listened closely to how much depended on the rhythm section. Beard was part of that equation. Then came Tush. The touring intensified. The audiences grew. The records kept coming. And the 3 musicians developed an unusual kind of stability. For decades, the same 3 faces represented ZZ Top. They were not constantly replacing members. They became a unit. For Beard, that meant something unusual in the music business. He spent most of his adult life inside the same band. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, ZZ Top was no longer simply a successful Texas rock group. It had become a cultural phenomenon. The band's 1983 album Eliminator pushed its music into a new commercial era. Songs such as Gimme All Your Lovin', Sharp Dressed Man, and Legs became international hits, while the band's highly stylized music videos turned Gibbons, Hill and Beard into instantly recognizable figures of the MTV era. The strange thing was that Beard's fame grew without him needing to become the loudest personality in the room. His job was still the same. Sit behind the drums. Count the song in. Hold the groove. Make sure everything else could move. But the financial consequences of that career were becoming enormous. ZZ Top built a massive touring operation. The band sold tens of millions of records and eventually released 15 studio albums. Their tours stretched across decades and continents. Their songs became part of radio, television, movies, and popular culture. Every tour added another chapter. Every successful record added another stream of income. Every year the band remained together increased the value of the music they had created. And Beard was there through almost all of it. There were difficult periods, too. His life was not an uninterrupted climb. During the 1970s, Beard struggled with addiction. The band eventually took a break, and Beard later got sober and returned to touring. His recovery became part of the larger story of how he managed to remain in the same demanding profession for decades. That matters when looking at the fortune he eventually accumulated. Because the money did not appear overnight. It was built year after year, album after album, concert after concert, decade after decade. Frank Beard was working while entire generations of music fans were growing up. He was behind the drums when ZZ Top moved from blues rock clubs into major venues. He was there when La Grange became a classic. He was there when Tush became a staple of rock radio. He was there when MTV transformed the band's public image. He was there for Gimme All Your Lovin', Sharp Dressed Man, and Legs. And he was still there when the music industry itself had changed almost completely. In 2004, ZZ Top received one of the highest honors available to an American rock band when it was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Hall's own records recognized the group as one of the most recognizable long-running acts in rock history. By then, Beard had spent roughly 35 years behind that drum kit, and he still had years ahead of him. That is what makes his financial story so difficult to reduce to a single number. A fortune estimated at $50 million may sound enormous. But behind an estimate like that are decades of work that most people never saw. Long nights, airports, sound checks, rehearsals, recording sessions, hotels, tours, business decisions, and thousands upon thousands of performances. The public saw the success. Beard lived the schedule that produced it. Eventually, the rewards of that career extended far beyond the stage. He built a private life in Texas. He developed interests outside music. He created a family life that existed separately from the larger-than-life image of ZZ Top. And that distinction would become increasingly important as the years passed. Because Frank Beard was never only the drummer people saw under stage lights. There was another Frank Beard. A husband. A father. A Texan. A man with a home, possessions, memories and relationships that had nothing to do with record sales. And that is where the story of his fortune becomes much more personal. The millions were one thing. The property was another. The music was another. But what happens when a man who spent 56 years helping define one of rock's most recognizable bands finally returns home for the last time? In the end, Frank Beard's greatest possessions may not have been the ones that could ever appear on an estate inventory. They may have been the things that surrounded him when the crowds were gone. His family, his Texas life, the memories built over decades, and the people who knew him before the world knew his name. Because behind the millions was a much quieter story, one involving a ranch in Richmond, a family that had shared decades with him, and a private world that became especially important during his final years. For Frank Beard, the most important part of life was never entirely visible from a stage. The world knew the drummer. It knew the sunglasses, the Texas attitude, the steady rhythm behind Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill. But away from ZZ Top, Beard had built something much less public. A family, a home, a life in Texas, and eventually, a place where the noise of the music business could be left at the gate. Frank Beard married Debbie Meredith in 1982, and the two remained together for decades. They had 3 children. Beard was known for keeping his private life largely away from the celebrity spotlight, even as ZZ Top became one of the most recognizable bands in the world. That privacy is important now, because after a death, people naturally want to know what happens to everything a famous person accumulated. Who gets the house? Who receives the money? What happens to the possessions? What was actually inside the private world that the public rarely saw? He had a family that had shared much of his adult life, and he had a home that became deeply connected to the final chapter of that life. The Top 40 Ranch in Richmond, Texas, was more than a location on a map. It was part of the world Beard created for himself. After spending decades moving between airports, hotels, rehearsal rooms and concert venues, the idea of having a place to return to carried a different meaning. The road is built around movement. A ranch is built around staying. And as Beard grew older, that difference mattered. He developed interests that had little to do with the demands of touring. Golf became one of his longtime passions, and he was known for participating in golf tournaments and local events. He also developed an interest in automobile racing, competing in sports car events in the 1990s, including the 24 Hours of Daytona and the 12 Hours of Sebring. These details might seem small compared with the history of ZZ Top, but they reveal something about Beard's life after the spotlight. He was not simply a musician waiting for the next tour. He had other worlds, other interests, other routines, other people who knew him as Frank rather than as the drummer from ZZ Top. And perhaps that is one reason his final years feel so different from the image of the band at its peak. The ZZ Top mythology was enormous. 3 musicians, long careers, huge songs, Texas humor, the famous beards of Gibbons and Hill, and Beard sitting behind them, almost ironically, without the giant beard. But the man himself had lived through difficult periods long before he reached his later years. His addiction struggles in the 1970s became one of the darker chapters of his life. As ZZ Top's success increased, Beard later acknowledged that his drug use had become destructive. He sought treatment, and the band took a break while he worked through the problem. His own accounts of that period made clear that addiction had affected his relationships and that sobriety required him to change the way he lived. That chapter is worth remembering because it puts the later Frank Beard into perspective. The man who eventually had a ranch, a family and decades of financial success had not been handed an easy path. There were years when the success itself created problems. There were moments when fame and money could not solve what was happening inside his life. And there was a point when he had to step away from everything and rebuild. He did. Then he returned to ZZ Top. And for decades after that, he kept going. That persistence became one of the defining characteristics of his career. In 2002, Beard underwent an emergency appendectomy and temporarily stepped away from the band. More than 2 decades later, he again had to take breaks from touring because of health problems. In 2025, he temporarily left ZZ Top's touring schedule because of an unspecified medical issue. The distinction is important. The public was told that he was dealing with health issues. The public was not given a complete medical history, so there is no reason to invent one. What can be documented is that age and health eventually began to affect his ability to remain on the road. And that became especially clear in 2026. ZZ Top had spent more than half a century performing together in one form or another. But the physical demands of touring do not disappear simply because a musician has become famous. The long drives, the flights, the rehearsals, the late nights, the physical effort of performing, the constant movement. For a man in his 70s, those demands were no longer the same as they had been when he was 20. Then came August. ZZ Top's tour plans began to change. The band's scheduled concert at the Hollywood Bowl was canceled on August 5th. Days later, Beard stepped away from the tour because of health problems, with Michael Monaghan stepping in on drums. To the audience, it may have looked like another temporary adjustment. ZZ Top had dealt with substitutions before. Beard had stepped away before. There had been medical interruptions before. But this time was different. On August 17, 2026, Frank Beard died at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, while receiving hospice care. His family members were beside him. His cause of death was not publicly disclosed. There is something significant about that setting. Not because it was dramatic, because it was private. For a musician who had spent 56 years performing before enormous audiences, the final scene was not a stadium. It was home. The same general Texas world that had surrounded the later part of his life became the place where that life ended. And suddenly, All those things that had seemed secondary to the music became much more important. His wife, his children, the ranch, the photographs, the objects collected through decades, the memories attached to rooms and places, the ordinary details of a life that cannot be measured on a balance sheet. That is the part people sometimes miss when they hear a celebrity's estimated net worth. A fortune can tell you something about what a person earned, cannot tell you what a home meant. It cannot tell you which photograph gets picked up after the funeral. It cannot tell you which song makes a child remember a parent. It cannot tell you which corner of a house suddenly feels different because someone who was always there is no longer there. And Frank Beard had accumulated an extraordinary amount of history. There were drums. There were instruments and musical equipment connected to a lifetime of performing. There were photographs and memorabilia. There were decades of ZZ Top experiences that could never be reproduced. There was the history of playing alongside Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill. And then there was the family history that existed entirely outside the band. What we can see is the shape of the life he left behind. A successful musician who earned substantial wealth. A husband who remained married to Debbie Meredith for decades. A father of 3. A Texan who built a private world away from the center of celebrity culture. A musician whose work became part of American rock history. And a man who, despite everything he achieved, ultimately reached the same place every person reaches. The point where the career stops. The touring stops. The business stops. And the people left behind are forced to look at the life that remains. For Beard, that loss was made even heavier by something that had already happened 5 years earlier. Dusty Hill had died in 2021. For decades, Hill had been the other half of the rhythm section beside Beard. Their partnership was so familiar that it almost seemed permanent. Then it wasn't. Hill's death changed ZZ Top forever. Elwood Francis eventually joined the band after Hill's passing, allowing Gibbons and Beard to continue performing. Beard had already lost one of the 2 men with whom he had shared the defining musical chapter of his life. Now he was gone too. Billy Gibbons was left as the surviving original member of that classic trio. When Beard died, Gibbons described him as a great friend and collaborator and praised his inventive drumming and his connection to Texas. He also made clear that the band intended to continue, reflecting Beard's wishes. That tribute says something about Beard that a financial estimate never could. To Gibbons, Beard was not a number. He was a friend, a collaborator, the drummer whose backbeat had helped keep ZZ Top moving for decades. The person who had been there through the band's rise, its biggest records, its biggest tours, its difficult periods and its transformations. And now, after more than 5 decades, the partnership was over. But the music was not. The songs remain. The recordings remain. The performances preserved on film remain. And every time those familiar drums begin beneath a ZZ Top guitar riff, the history of that sound comes rushing back. That is the strange thing about leaving behind a fortune. The money may eventually be divided. Property may eventually change hands. Possessions may eventually move from one room to another. But music behaves differently. It stays where it is. A recording does not age in the same way a person does. A song can return decades later and make someone feel as if the past is briefly opened again. And Frank Beard left behind thousands of moments like that. Still, one question remains. After more than 5 decades of records, touring, royalties, business, property and success, what was Frank Beard's life actually worth? How much did all those years produce? And what can responsibly be said about the fortune now associated with his name? For more than 5 decades, Frank Beard's name was attached to one of the most successful rock bands America ever produced. Now, after his death, another number has begun appearing beside his name. Approximately $50 million. That is the outside estimate often reported for Frank Beard's wealth at the time of his death. Frank Beard did not spend 56 years behind the drums of ZZ Top without building substantial financial success. The band sold more than 50 million records worldwide. It produced major hits, toured extensively and maintained a remarkable commercial presence across multiple generations. That success created multiple potential sources of income. There were record sales. There were tours. There were recording sessions. There were royalties connected to music. There were decades of professional earnings. There were investments and property interests. And there was the long-term value of being part of a catalog that continues to be heard around the world. For Frank Beard, the most reasonable conclusion is that decades of ZZ Top's commercial success provided the foundation for considerable personal wealth. The rest remains private. And perhaps that is appropriate. Because Frank Beard spent much of his life keeping the financial details of his private world away from the public. The public saw the concerts. It saw the records. It saw the cars, the stage clothes, the Texas image, and the music videos. But it did not see every financial decision made behind the scenes. It did not see every investment. It did not see every private transaction. And it certainly does not know the full contents of his estate. What is publicly known is that Beard owned and lived at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, the place where he received hospice care during his final days. That property is now part of the story people naturally want to understand. Frank Beard leaves behind a fortune that makes everyone cry. The tears are not really about $50 million. They are about what the money represents. Think about what it took to accumulate that kind of wealth. A lifetime of work. A career that began when Beard was barely out of his teens. Thousands of hours spent playing drums. Years of rehearsals. Decades of touring. Long periods away from home. The physical demands of performing. The pressure of maintaining a world-famous band. The changes in the music business. The changes in his own body. And still he kept going. The young drummer who once played alongside Dusty Hill became a 70-year-old musician still associated with one of rock's most enduring groups. That is extraordinary in itself. But the older Beard became, the more valuable the private world outside the stage appeared. His ranch, his family, his routines, his Texas identity, the things that did not require an audience. Money can provide comfort. It can provide security. It can provide a beautiful home and the freedom to pursue interests that would otherwise be impossible. But it cannot stop time. It cannot reverse illness. It cannot bring someone back. And Frank Beard had already learned that lesson before his own final days. In 2021, Dusty Hill died. For more than half a century, Hill had stood beside Beard as part of the defining ZZ Top rhythm section. Their musical relationship had survived changing trends, changing technology, and changing audiences. Then suddenly, one half of that partnership was gone. Beard continued. Billy Gibbons continued. ZZ Top continued with Elwood Francis on bass. But the original trio could never return. That loss gave Beard's later years another layer of history. He was not simply carrying the weight of his own age. He was carrying memories of a bandmate who had shared the greatest chapter of his life. And now Beard himself has become part of that history. Billy Gibbons' tribute after Beard's death captured the importance of that relationship. Gibbons called him a great friend and collaborator and praised him as one of the most naturally innovative drummers. He specifically pointed to Beard's signature backbeat as a key part of ZZ Top's sound. That description matters, because a drummer can sometimes disappear behind the people standing at the front of the stage. But remove the drummer, and the entire shape of the music changes. Frank Beard was not background. He was the pulse. Listen to La Grange. Listen to Tush. Listen to Gimme All Your Lovin'. Listen to Sharp Dressed Man. Listen to Legs. The guitar may be the first thing many people notice. The vocals may be what they remember. But underneath it all is the rhythm. That was Beard's territory. And after his death, that rhythm becomes something different. It becomes memory. The music will continue to play. People will continue to discover ZZ Top. Young musicians will continue to study the band's groove. Older fans will continue to hear those songs and remember where they were when they first heard them. A person can disappear from the stage. A recording does not. That is one of the strange forms of permanence music provides. Frank Beard's physical possessions may eventually be divided. His property may eventually change hands. His financial estate may eventually be settled privately. But the recordings remain exactly where he left them. They do not need an inheritance document. They do not need a beneficiary. They simply play. And that may be the most valuable thing he left behind. Not because it can be sold, because it can still be experienced. There is also something deeply human in the fact that Frank Beard's final surroundings were so different from the world he had spent decades entertaining. He had played for enormous crowds. He had performed under lights. He had traveled across countries. He had become part of the history of American rock. Yet on August 17, 2026, he died at his ranch in Richmond while receiving hospice care, with family members at his side. His cause of death was not publicly disclosed. That is the reality beneath all the numbers. A family was there. Not an audience. Not a television camera. Not thousands of strangers. Family. And whatever private conversations, memories or emotions existed in those final hours belonged to them. Frank Beard spent his life doing something very few musicians ever accomplish. He found the people he was meant to play with. He stayed with them. He survived the difficult years. He became part of a band that crossed generations. He helped create songs that became permanent pieces of American rock. He built substantial wealth. He created a private life in Texas. He raised a family. And when the road finally ended, he was at home. That changes the meaning of the word fortune. A fortune is usually measured in money, but a life can contain another kind of wealth. A marriage that lasted decades. Children who knew their father beyond the stage. Friends who knew the man behind the drummer. A ranch that represented years of private life. If you have a favorite Frank Beard performance, a favorite ZZ Top song, or a memory connected to the band, share it in the comments. And if you want more respectful stories about legendary figures and the lives they left behind, subscribe for the next one.